in Canada, sort of what you can look at out your window. But it, again, the demise came. I mean, this should have been a 6-year wave that's still going on. But we had 2008, the global financial crash, and people's focus changed. But the interesting thing to me, and I think this is quite fascinating and has implications for what we do, what came after that was different than the earlier waves. The idea of green economic stimulus was born. It wasn't taken up much in Canada because we have a government that doesn't use the word green. But in almost everywhere else on Earth, other than Canada, in Europe, in Korea, in Japan, in Australia, in some Canadian provinces, Ontario, used support for alternative energy, better public transit investment, infrastructure investment, smart grids, all these kinds of things were seen as a way to stimulate the economy and move it towards a future where the real economic growth comes about through green industries. The future. Totally the opposite of where environmentalism came from in 1970. So instead of saying, this economy is too rich, it's too much stuff, we got to get rid of it all, and go back to the land, we're all of a sudden, how do you fix the economy? Call the environmentalists, they'll know what to do. Transformation. So it wasn't, so it took place in universities with sustainability programs, renewable energy programs, and in terms of products, and in terms of very large-scale public investment. So it really was from protesters to the new economic gurus. Obama certainly got into that in the first 2 years of his term with massive attempt to massively invest in high-speed rail, smart grids, farmers market healthy diet initiatives, for example. But most of that in the U.S. was halted with the 2010 midterm elections, which elected a whole House of Representatives full of Stephen Harper's. It all stopped. But at the same time, many, many other nations have continued it. Guyana, in Latin America, has a low-carbon development strategy, LCDS. Google LCDS. You'll get the Guyana low-carbon development strategy. And even of all countries on Earth you'd expect it to come from, there's massive renewable energy investment from Saudi Arabia. They are moving to a very high percentage of their energy, electricity from solar over the next 5 years. They certainly have the capital to do it, but I find that quite fascinating. A lot of corporations are, General Electric, Eco-Imagination, over 25% of General Electric, which was a few years ago the highest capitalized corporation on Earth, comes from basically windmills, turbines for windmills, all that kind of renewable energy stuff. The U.S. auto industry, railroads, the state of Texas, which has more wind power than any other jurisdiction in North America, by far. The Ontario FIT program. A lot of these initiatives are still coming, even in these times. At the same time, I'm getting towards the end here. There's been a surge back politically. I won't go on about it too much, but it's sort of conservatives have also evolved in an interesting and dramatic way. Whereas previously conservatives would try to ignore the environment and pretend it wasn't there and kind of cut back the budget when no one was looking. Now they're very assertive in rejecting not just environmentalism, but even science and technology. Several U.S. states, I think Ohio is one, they wanted to build high-speed rail across, a big piece of the U.S. There's gaps. The states were all 80–90% of the money was coming from the federal government. What government turns down money they don't have to tax that they would not build to see high-speed rail as some kind of plot by the United Nations? This is true. Arizona, Florida, several, 2010 elected state governments think Agenda 21 is a communist plot to take over the United States, and once they get high-speed rail, they're going to take your guns. See?
If only that's true.
Anyway, so on the one hand, we're economic gurus. On the other hand, we're seen as some kind of evil plot by 30% of the population, higher in some jurisdictions. And there are very visible and absolutely bizarre attacks on environmentalism. I used to write about environmentalism in the 70s as motherhood. I mean, not everybody bought what we were saying, but nobody thought we were an evil plot. Very few saw it that way. The Heartland Institute, if you know what that is, it's a oil company funded kind of anti-climate change organization. It put up billboards linking climate science as an idea to various kinds of lunatics, like Saddam Hussein and Manson, the mass murderer of California. They'd have a picture of these people and say, they still believe in climate science. I mean, just amazing. So anyway, we're in this kind of reality where what does this mean for environmental studies? And I'll conclude with that. On the one hand, I think a majority of the planet and a majority of North Americans think we have, capability of transforming the economy in a good way, and are, more than willing to buy what we're selling, to take those courses, especially the more practical, hands-on kinds of courses. While another group thinks we're, the devil incarnate, returned to Earth. So what does that imply for environmental studies? I think we simply have to assume that we cannot go back to pre-1970, that this really isn't going to happen. We don't have to worry about those crazy people that much. I think the trick, and I picked it up in the conversation at the end of the discussion yesterday afternoon for those that were here, we need to somehow retain the old subversive kind of, what is environmental studies? It's questioning how society does things. It questions our institutions. It has doubts about the economic model we're operating within. It doesn't let that go. But at the same time, it doesn't get locked into crisis talk. Oh my God, the climate is changing. We're all going to, our hair is going to catch on fire by 2015. That isn't going to happen. It's a big planet. It's going to take 50 years before this is, before we get to the catastrophe stage. And a lot can change in that kind of time. Look back 50 years. Going forward, it could be very different. We don't want to get endlessly, locked into crisis talk and worry, and we need to be open to educating people who will go out in the world and produce food and goods and services and culture differently than we have in the past, and we need to think about how they're to do that, how they're to start a business, how they're to work within a corporate structure, and and do things differently as best they can, both as citizens and as producers. And I think that's what environmental studies can, in fact, do.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks Tim and Doug for organizing this and inviting us. I just wanted to say that there's lots of chairs over here. If people want to move, we thought it would be more intense, all together. Nobody's. All right. There's been a really precipitous drop in applications to environmental studies programs in Ontario this year. It's almost 12% across the system. And this is despite the fact that there's some legislation, promoting green energy and a green economy. So I wanted to this morning give a brief history of environmental studies issues as a general context. A brief history of York's Faculty of Environmental Studies, sort of situated within that context, and then talk about how we understand what's happening, what the current climate is for environmental studies today, and essentially what should be done, if anything, about it. And a lot of what I'm going to say in terms of giving that broader context is somebody else's paper. And again, I have to thank Tim. It was a reading that he assigned for the first year master's course last year by Sewell and Press from 1998. What is environmental studies? And I found it gave me so many tools for understanding what was happening in environmental studies at York that I thought I would use that as a preliminary frame. I don't know how many people are familiar with that article. A few, some.
The reference is in the package, in the supplementary package,
yeah.
if anybody wants.
Good. So the basic thesis of their article is that environmental studies is too multidisciplinary to be either coherent or rigorous. And we heard that argument as well yesterday as critics. So this is coming from critics within environmental studies. And their argument is that the original conflict in 100 years ago was between conservation and preservation, this sort of whether you're ecocentric or anthropocentric. And they argued as well that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring really helped focus on issues of pollution and health, human health as well as ecosystem health. Again, that probably wasn't in the language yet, but non-human health. And that the 1960s and 70s then were this tremendous period of experimentation. And they said that the first programs were emphasizing both science and social science, the basics and backgrounds of understanding social, economic, political, and ecological relationships. And I really want to emphasize that again, that notion of relationships and the need for social change. So ecology actually emerged at that same time as a new and subversive science, which was at the center of many environmental studies curricula. Faculties struggled in the 1970s to create what they considered a coherent curricula and create this new kind of synthesis of disciplines. At the end of this early period, most programs were relying on one area or another, that is either environmental science, environmental policy and planning, or cultural studies. So you can see the divide there between a science-based, social science-based, and humanities-based approach to environmental studies. So again, the authors argued that the growth of the field actually exacerbated the lack of coherence in the curriculum. and the fact that it was virtually limitless as a field. New areas emerged. They argued that more confusion and conflict also emerged, including conflicts over basic ideologies, how you define environmental problems, how you analyze environmental problems, and then consequently what kinds of solutions or actions you propose as a result. The authors believed that this kind of open door policy of welcoming faculty regardless of their disciplinary background was what created these ideological conflicts and the breakdown of collegial relations. And they say that they see the conflict basically as between empiricists and social critics. So social critics, they include postmodernists, environmental justice advocates, and revolutionaries of various kinds, who tend to be deeply skeptical about pragmatism and incremental change. Context, ethnography, cultural differences, narrative, all of these things play a major role in the analysis used by those in the social critic kind of school of thought. And they criticize scientists for being too technicist. Empiricists, on the other hand, emphasize problem solving, incremental change, and the skills necessary to be effective. And disputes between these two groups can devolve into the former, that is the social critics, accusing the latter, the scientists, of being naive or even racist. And we have had instances like this in our faculty. And a quote, given these differences in core beliefs, values, and methods, conflict among faculty in environmental studies is inevitable. I thought that the perfect example of this was that, in fact, those debates over population growth. Whether it's, I assume everybody knows those arguments. I don't have to go into them. Institutional problems stem from the fact that universities are not intrinsically designed to promote experimentation, particularly in multidisciplinarity. And traditional institutions consider environmental studies radical, unorthodox, biased, and threatening. So they again argue that autonomy is essential for the survival of a uniquely kind of activist orientation, which characterizes a lot of environmental studies. So they propose some solutions to this problem. And they've accepted this also. They've accepted the critique of quality and rigor, and which I think I don't. And they said that in undergraduate programs in particular, they tend to be superficial kind of knowledge that students gain and of shallow pedagogy. Their proposed solutions are that there be a required core of courses, that they require a minor in a discipline, and I think that idea was expressed yesterday as well. They require a thesis to get some depth, and they require a specialization within environmental studies. But the authors are actually highly critical of this at the same time. They say this is one approach, but it doesn't necessarily provide the grounding that they believe students need. So they also suggest re-examining the objectives and content of that core curriculum to provide students with a common language, sufficient depth and grounding to be good citizens and lifelong learners. And they go on to emphasize a core focused on the empiricist side, which again we heard a lot about bringing science more to the fore of environmental studies programs. And they say this is in order to create grads who can actually be problem solvers in the real world. So their conclusions and recommendations were that there really should be 3 different kinds of environmental studies programs, and that we shouldn't be trying to do all of this in one program. There should be in fact, and they break down along those three lines. There should be programs that emphasize ecology and environmental policy analysis. Those are that sort of resource management and environmental science approaches, and that those fit well in a science faculty. That there should be environmental studies programs that emphasize literature, ethics, and philosophy, and those would fit well in a humanities faculty. And the third is the social criticism, critical theory kind of approach, emphasizing environmental justice, equity, even feminist and other emancipatory perspectives, and those would fit well in a social science faculty. So, quote, "We believe, however, that mixing them is pedagogically questionable and institutionally disastrous, the former because the subject matter is too broad, the latter because the combinations bring together faculty with deeply divergent worldviews." And so they say, well, in rare instances, this kind of mix can stimulate cross-fertilization that's productive. They say, on the whole, it creates conflict, chronic disagreement on issues of program identity, directions for growth, curricular content, and faculty recruitment. Those are indeed the things that we fight over all the time at York. I think productively, however. They say, well, it's possible to manage this conflict, and that's what the dean does. Achieving the dual objectives of curricular coherence and rigor requires limits on diversity. So I agree with a lot of what they say and disagree with a lot of what they say. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the faculty of environmental studies at York and how I think it fits or struggles with these issues and how it's changed also over time. And I'm not keeping track of my time. Okay. All right, so environmental studies at York.
We have to record Dr. Ken for the session that you lost.
Okay, thanks. Began in 1968, and we started actually with only a master's program. For the first 22 years, it was just a graduate program in environmental studies, and we really first embraced a broader definition of environment, not simply as the natural environment, but as context, really. So built environments, which is how I got there. My background's in urban planning. We even had quite a strength for a long time in organizational environments, although that's the people that did that have all retired now. So we define it now as sort of natural, built, and social environments. And the center part of the coherence and the rigor came primarily from our requirement that students create their own plans of study. So there is essentially each student creates their own program. And in the first term of study, that's when they have to write up their plan of study and define what their program is going to be. So they define their own area of concentration. And in a very rationalist way, they break it up into learning objectives, learning strategies, and by the end of their program, they are supposed to be able to synthesize all of this into a coherent and rigorous whole. So rather than having a curriculum that does that, we ask each individual student to do that out of the array of things that we offer. And what's happened over time is that we've seen students combine things that none of us had ever combined before. And new areas emerge out of that. And an example is that I had a student in the mid-90s who wanted to do sort of food studies and planning. And she really struggled because there was no literature, there was nobody doing it, and we just kept saying, "Oh, you can do it." You know, you study the different parts, and then you figure out how to put it all together. And of course she did. And there are a lot of examples like that. In 1991, we started a bachelor's and a PhD program at the same time. And much like the the ups and downs with the economy, we also noticed the ups and downs going with legislation. The Bachelor's in Environmental Studies program got off to a pretty good start in '91, but in '97, I think, when the Harris government basically took environmental studies out of the teachables in the education, people stopped seeing this as something that they could get a job with, and our numbers plummeted. And so around 2000, we started thinking again about how do we attract undergrads to environmental studies, and we decided our first tack at this had been too broad. We modeled it too much like the master's program, and students were floundering, we decided. So instead we set up 4 areas of concentration within the bachelor's program so that they would choose between urban and regional environments, environmental politics, culture and environment, or environmental management. And in the PhD program, where the province of Ontario requires you to designate fields of expertise, you're not required to do that in the master's program, so we don't declare any fields. Students do this, right? They each define their own field. We made 2 very broad categories that are entirely meaningless, if you ask me, for our PhD program, but they act as kind of umbrellas. And they basically got the reviewers off of that so that PhD students could create their own programs in the same way that master's students do. But there is conflict, and I would say conflict is endemic to environmental studies. We do argue constantly over program identity, directions for growth, and again, we've been moving into sustainable energy, food security, some more applied areas, and I know that the faculty who have more of a humanities background have worried about whether they're or not, whether their area is going to shrink or, well, the whole faculty has shrunk a little bit because of budget cuts. And faculty recruitment, I'd say our biggest fights are over hiring. And it does go back to that sort of basic value systems and orientation. And my own sense is that each group is struggling to have someone to support their view, right? And so I think that what we share is an extraordinary commitment to the project of environmental studies. We don't always agree on what that project is, but there's real fierce loyalty, I think, to the program, in large part both because of the unusual kinds of research that happens and the cross-fertilization among faculty. For example, something that you would otherwise, I don't think, see is that we have one project where an avian biologist is working with someone who does international development and sort of a critique of resource development. So the two are working together on the impact of oil and mining on migratory birds. So you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I think they were surprised by that alliance, and the rest of us were. But they've gotten funding, and they struggled, but they're doing, I think, great work. And the other thing I think that really binds us together is the work that our students do, and the fact that we learn from them as much as I think as I hope they learn from us. So what's happening? So now we're seeing again this decline in applications, and it's in the university structure. That they breathe down my neck as the dean, and say, why are your applications dropping? What are you going to do about it? What's your recruitment strategy? As if I had control over what's happening, in the world. So I say, well, Environment Canada has just cut 700 people, and 3 of them were actually seconded to the Faculty of Environmental Studies. They've been doing research with us for the last 5 years. One of them was able to retire. We've kept him on as an adjunct. Another left Ontario and has gotten a job out on the East Coast. And the third one, I actually don't know what had happened. He just kind of disappeared. That gutting of environmental legislation, and the parents in particular saying, what is my child going to be able to do when they leave? The media really pitting environmental, and economic issues against one another. So I understand that young people are worried about jobs, and I know that when I was starting out, I wasn't, right? The 60s and 70s, the world was open, right? You felt you could do anything. So I guess the question is, despite the fact that everybody knows we need to have this kind of green economic transformation, what students are applying for in record numbers, in Ontario anyway, are business, science, and engineering. And we saw recently, too, the way Harvard has started to talk about environmentalists, not just as radicals, but as terrorists, right? That we're completely out of touch, and that I think what's happening in the university too with this activity-based budgeting is a real neoliberal approach to education. Everything is emphasizing the individual. What's the individual going to do? What kind of job is this individual going to get? What kind of how do the different faculties and programs compete with one another? Everything's about competition and showing how you can balance your budget or make money. When was the university about that? It was kind of new. And the idea that there are collective and cooperative approaches to social issues seems to be falling out of favor. Again, York University has a mission statement that has social justice as part of its mandate. And so I do keep raising it when they try to change that. We're constantly talking about how we're going to rebrand the university, and you can hear the skin sizzling there, branding. And I keep going back to the mission, and saying that we shouldn't just be talking about individuals getting jobs and getting training for jobs, but how are they going to contribute to the overall society and have some social relevance. I think I want to just stop by saying, the barriers are these shrinking budgets, declining applications, challenges from those who don't understand us or don't care, conflict within, and difficulty, again, the issue that I raised yesterday about communicating clearly to those outside environmental studies what it is we're about. And the potential is always the quality of the faculty, the students, and the programs, and the ability to show that students, faculty, and alumni in particular, I think, are making a difference. I think if we can show, and I think, again, around the job issue, a lot of our grads have jobs that didn't exist even 5 years ago, right? They're creating new fields, they're creating new jobs. We can't tell them necessarily what they're going to do because they're the ones who are going to create it. So I see as our potential the fact that we are still creating activist scholars. And I will stop there.